Hello everybody and welcome back to another entry of iKenSleep. We are now in April and it is the 1st of April, so happy April Fool's Day to you guys. Hopefully everything has gone well in your guys' day without a hitch. Hopefully nothing's happened or anything like that. But for those of you who are just feeling foolish or feeling like fools because that's just how you are, it is okay. If that's really who you are, embrace it. Make the most out of it. Celebrate today because it is your day. Make April Fools your day. Now, as just a reminder per usual, if you are enjoying these readings and would like for me to continue doing these readings, please show some support by leaving me some likes, comments, sharing my stuff, and following me on my platforms like Spotify at iKenSleep, YouTube at iKenWin, TikTok at iKenWin, and Instagram at officially.iKenWin. Now let's ascend back into Heaven Official's blessings. Chapter 9, Dallying HuaLian, Nightfall in Sinner's Pit. Part 2. HuaLian had never imagined that would be the answer, and said with such seriousness too. He thought it was a little funny, but it also made him feel inexplicably strange. His chest growing slightly warm for some reason. You can't possibly keep holding me like this. I could, Sunlung replied. HuaLian was only joking, but Sunlung's reply had no trace of humor. Suddenly, HuaLian didn't know how to respond. While they were talking, Chemo never ceased attacking. Both of Sunlung's hands were holding him firmly, but something else was keeping Chemo at bay, whipping him to his defeat. While slowly backing off, he shouted, "That bitch made you to." He hadn't yet finished his words when a large boom sounded. The massive man fell to the ground, beaten to the point where he could no longer stand. Having heard this, HuaLian said, "Sunlung, don't kill him. We'll still need to question him if we want to get out of here." Sunlung indeed stopped his attacks and remained still. I wasn't planning on killing him anyway. Otherwise, he wouldn't have lasted till now. Dead silence returned anew to the bottom of the Sinner's Pit. After a moment, HuaLian asked, "Sunlung, were you the one who did all this down here? Even if nothing was visible in the dark, with such an overpowering stench of blood, such an aura of bloodlust, and Chemo's madness and rage, it was obvious what happened down here." There was another moment of silence before HuaLian heard Sunlung's response. "Yes," he said. It was the expected answer. HuaLian sighed. How should I say this? HuaLian chewed on his words and organized his thoughts before continuing in an earnest tone. "Sunlung, next time you see a pit like this, don't just jump in it randomly. I couldn't even stop you. Really, I didn't know what to do." Sunlung didn't seem to expect that kind of response and was stumped for a moment. When he spoke again, he sounded a bit odd. "You don't want to ask anything else?" "What else do you want me to ask?" HuaLian said. "For example, whether I'm human," Sunlung replied. HuaLian rubbed his forehead. I don't think that's necessary." "Is it not?" "Is it? It's not important whether you're human or not," HuaLian said. "Oh?" HuaLian crossed his own arms while being held in Sunlung's and replied, "Forming a friendship should depend on how well two people hit it off and how well their personalities match, not their identities. If I like you, you could be a beggar and I'd still like you. If I dislike you, you could be the emperor and I'd still dislike you. Shouldn't it be like that? It's simple logic, so whether you're human or not is irrelevant." Sunlung laughed out loud. "Yeah, you're very right." "Right?" HuaLian said, laughing along too. But the more he laughed, the more he felt something was off, and it came to him suddenly. He was still letting Sunlung carry him, and the scary thing was, he had gotten used to being in this position without realizing it. This was gonna be the death of him. HuaLian cleared his throat quietly and said, Sunlung, We can talk about that later. Why don't you put me down first? Sanlang seemed to have flashed a smile and said, Hold on. He carried HuaLian and walked on for a bit before gently setting him down. When HuaLian was back on his own 2 feet, he could feel hard, flat ground. Thanks. Sanlang made no gesture in response, and after thanking him, HuaLian gazed upward. In the deep blue sky, there hung a brilliant crescent moon. Exceptionally beautiful. It was just that it was framed by a squared-off sky that made him feel like a frog stargazing in the well. HuaLian tried urging Roye to reach for the top again, but as expected, it only leapt up halfway before it was stopped by something invisible and rebounded, unable to go higher. There's an array drawn around the sinner's pit, Sanlang said. I know. I just wanted to give it a try, HuaLian said. I can't give up until I've tried, you know? I wonder how the others are doing up there. Will that girl in black also sweep them down? He recounted to Sanlang how the girl who was hanged on the pole suddenly escaped and swept all the soldiers down into the pit. While talking, he stepped on something on the ground. It appeared to be an arm, and HuaLian almost tripped. He steadied himself immediately, but Sanlang still reached out and helped support him, chiding. Be careful. I told you the ground was dirty, Sanlang added casually. HuaLian now understood what dirty meant and said, It's fine. I want to ignite a palm torch, see what's happened down here and go from there. Sanlang didn't respond. Just then, from afar, Kimo's cold voice bellowed again. You two, doing the bidding of that bitch, the thousands of wronged souls of this kingdom will curse you! HuaLian turned toward Kimo and asked using the Banyue tongue. General Kimo, who is that person you speak of? Kimo replied hatefully. Why pretend to ask? That evil cultivator! Is it the female cultivator who roams the city streets? Kimo spat angrily on the ground, and HuaLian took that as a yes. He continued to question. Weren't you a loyal supporter of the Banyue State Preceptor? Kimo was provoked by his words and yelled. I, Kimo, will never again be loyal to her. I can never forgive that bitch. A long string of curses followed. Kimo was hysterical and spoke rapidly, so fast that HuaLian blanked out at the end, unable to follow. He quietly whispered, Sanlang, Sanlang. And so, Sanlang translated. He's cursing. He says that woman betrayed his country, opened the city gates, and let the Yang'an army in to slaughter. She's got the blood of her people on her hands, and of his brothers who she pushed into this pit. He will hang her dead 1,000 times, 10,000 times. Wait, hold on, HuaLian quickly exclaimed. How could this be? There were 2 things that didn't match. First, the woman cultivator roaming in the city streets that HuaLian spoke of earlier was supposed to be the lady in white. But now, Kimo was calling the Banyue State Preceptor bitch and saying she pushed his brothers into the sinner's pit. Earlier, when the black-clad girl swept the soldiers into the pit, Kimo swore and cursed her with the same profanity, plus the last bit, hang her dead 1,000 times. HuaLian suddenly realized they didn't seem to be talking about the same person. Secondly, it was the Banyue Preceptor who betrayed the kingdom of Banyue? HuaLian interrupted Kimo. General, the Banyue State Preceptor you speak of, is it the girl in black hanging on the pole of the sinner's pit? Who else could it be if not her? Kimo shouted. The scrawny, corpse-like girl in black was the real State Preceptor of Banyue. But if that was the case, who were the lady cultivator and her black-clad companion, who strolled through the streets looking to kill them? The girl in black had immeasurable strange powers and could easily sweep dozens of fierce, powerful Banyue soldiers off the wall. So how was she hanged above the sinner's pit? The story was getting more and more bizarre, more and more convoluted, the more HuaLian listened. General, I want to ask... No more questions, Kimo interrupted. You killed my soldiers. What else could you want to know? I won't answer. Now fight me. I killed them. He didn't do anything, Sun Lang said. You can answer his questions and fight me. Well, that was irrefutable logic. Kimo yelled angrily. You're both her helpers. There's no difference. HuaLian immediately said, General Kimo, I think you've misunderstood. The only reason we've come to the Gobi is to get rid of the State Preceptor of Banyue. How can we be the helpers she sent for? Hearing that HuaLian was actually there to destroy the State Preceptor, Kimo fell silent. After a while, he asked, If you weren't helping her, then why did you kill my soldiers? Because you were going to throw us into the pit and we had to defend ourselves? HuaLian explained. Nonsense, Kimo argued. I didn't throw a single one of you. I even caught you. You all jumped down yourselves. Yes, we all jumped into the pit ourselves, HuaLian said. General, we're all trapped at the bottom of this pit. Let's just call it a truce for now, alright? Why did that Banyue State Preceptor open the city gates to let the enemies in? As if Kimo would listen to reason. He said resentfully, You two are despicable. Fighting me 2-on-1. HuaLian felt a little exasperated. I really only smacked you once. I didn't do much. He didn't mind being called despicable, or sly, or whatever. If the situation called for it, never mind 2-on-1. He would bring 100 to beat one down. Who cared about fighting fair? But earlier, Sun Lang obviously had the upper hand even while carrying him, and he also told HuaLian not to fight. Kimo seemed to think he could have won if it had just been him and Sun Lang though, and HuaLian felt bad for him. Still, it seemed Kimo was the type who could easily be made to spill the beans. HuaLian would just have to go slow. Not a problem. Sun Lang, on the other hand, didn't have the same patience. He said leisurely, You'd better answer his questions, for the sake of your soldiers. You already killed them, Kimo said. It's pointless using them to threaten me. They are dead, but their corpses are still around, Sun Lang replied. Kimo grew alarmed, unable to remain sprawled on the ground anymore. What are you planning? That depends on what you do, Sun Lang said. Just by his voice, HuaLian could imagine the way Sun Lang would narrow his eyes when he spoke. Do you want their next lives to be fortuitous, or for them to be reborn as a pool of blood? Kimo stopped but soon understood what Sun Lang meant. You! The people of Banyue took death and funerals very seriously. They believed that however the deceased looked at the time of their death, that was how they would be reborn. For instance, if the deceased was missing an arm, they would be reborn disabled. If the corpse in this pit were destroyed, what would their rebirths be like? General Kimo was a purebred man of Banyue and couldn't help but be afraid. As expected, on the other side of the dark pit, Kimo gritted his teeth soundly in rage. Then after a while, he relented helplessly. Don't touch their bodies! They were good, brave soldiers. It was already a tragedy that they were trapped in this pit for so many years. I don't know if being killed by you is a blessing or not, but I will not have their corpses humiliated further. He paused, then asked, Are you really here to kill Banyue? HuaLian replied warmly, That is no lie. The more we know, the better chance we have of winning. Very little is known about the State Preceptor of Banyue in the outside world, so we have no idea how to fight her even if we want to. But you have worked under her before in the past, so perhaps you can enlighten us? Maybe it was because they shared the same enemy, the State Preceptor of Banyue, that a sort of bond was developed. Or perhaps in this inescapable abyss, atop the dead bodies of his soldiers? Kimo became disheartened. Whatever the case, Kimo seemed to have lost the will to attack them. You don't know why she opened the gates and let those Yong'uns in? It's because she wanted revenge against us. She hates the kingdom of Banyue. What do you mean she hates the kingdom of Banyue? Isn't the Banyue State Preceptor a person of Banyue? HuaLian asked. Yes, But not entirely, Kimo replied. She's of mixed blood, and the other half is from Yong'an. Ah. As it turned out, the Banyue State Preceptor was born of a Banyue woman and a Yong'an man. Living on the border where the people of two nations shared mutual hatred of each other, things were difficult for an interracial couple. After a few years, the Yong'an man had finally had enough and moved away from the border, back to affluent and peaceful Yong'an. Although it was an amicable divorce, the Banyue woman soon passed away from heartache. They left behind a child, 6 or 7 years of age. Without any guardians, the child grew up missing meals. The couple had received cold shoulders everywhere when they were around, and now their daughter also received contempt wherever she went. The people of Banyue were tall and brawny and saw beauty in strength and liveliness. But this girl was born of mixed blood and appeared small and scrawny among the Banyue children. She grew up bullied and became more and more sullen. The Banyue children wouldn't play with her, though there were some Yong'an children who did pay attention to her. When this little mixed blood girl was about 10, a riot broke out at the border and the two armies fought. That battle took many lives, and afterward, the little girl disappeared. She had neither friends nor family in Banyue, so no one noticed or even cared when she vanished. However, the next time she appeared, it was a different story. In those years, she walked thousands of miles and single-handedly crossed the Gobi Desert to Yong'an. No one knew what kind of encounter she'd had, but when she returned, she had learned black magic and could control the venomous creature most feared by the citizens of Banyue, the scorpion snakes. Upon her return, though many were impressed, many were also afraid. That was because the girl's personality never changed. She was still gloomy and insociable. There were also many who bullied her in the past, so if she were to enter the palace and become a high-ranking official, wouldn't she one day seek revenge against them and cause trouble? I'm sure there were many who spoke poorly of her, HuaLian commented. Kimo humphed. It didn't stop at ill talk. They went straight to the palace to advise the king, saying she was an evil messenger sent forth from the Scorpion Snake clan, here to bring ruin to the kingdom of Banyue. But none of them succeeded. She got them hanged first? HuaLian guessed. Kimo was even more disgusted. You, man of Yong'an, why is your mind so full of depraved and vile developments? There was none of that. I protected her. HuaLian was exasperated. I already said I'm not from Yong'an. Alright, whatever. At the time, Kimo was already a distinguished, fierce warrior. There was an incident where he took his troops out to exterminate the nest of a band of desert bandits and brought the girl who had become the palace sorceress along. That group of bandits were strong, and they had built their lair below the sand. In that battle, both sides suffered casualties, and while Kimo stole the victory, the battle caused the lair below the sand to collapse. Between that and the coming of windstorms, they couldn't stay. Kimo retreated with some soldiers, but the other group, which included the sorceress, didn't manage to escape. Once they had retreated to a safe point and waited out the sandstorm, Kimo returned anew, hoping to dig out the soldiers to bury them properly. Yet who knew that when he got there, he found that the sorceress had, by her power alone, dug out a sizable hole and managed to drag all the surviving, wounded soldiers in to hide away from the winds. All the bodies of the dead were dug up too and laid out in neat order. She had done this all by herself. When they got there, the sorceress's body was stained with blood. But still, she guarded the entrance to that hole silently, hugging her knees and waiting for them like a little lone wolf. After that incident, I thought she was a good woman who acted on principle, Kimo said. I believed that she never had any intention of harming the kingdom of Banyue, so I became her guarantor with all my might and fought back against all those malicious voices. In addition, Kimo himself had been bullied growing up and could understand her strife. So naturally, he paid more attention to her. The more attention he paid, the more he realized just how powerful this girl was. Thus, he endorsed her all the way, helping her reach the position of state preceptor, while he became the one later recorded as the most loyal supporter of the state preceptor of Banyue. This lasted until another war broke out, and the kingdom of Yong'an sent armies to annihilate the kingdom of Banyue. With the two armies' conflict at a lengthy standstill, she conducted a grand ceremony to pray to the heavens, saying it was to bring blessings upon us Banyue soldiers, Kimo said. Thus the soldiers' will to kill was whipped up, their battle spirits inflamed, and they defended the city gates to the death. There were arrows, giant boulders, boiling oil, swords, and blades. The slaughter was endless and massive. Yet unexpectedly, just as the fighting was at its peak, the state preceptor suddenly opened the city gates. With the gates opened wide, millions of enemy troops swarmed into the city like mad. As the iron cavalry trampled past, the entire walled city instantly became a ritual of blood. Kimo, who was fighting hard against their enemies, went mad with rage when he heard that the state preceptor had opened the gates. But no matter how tough he was, one could not win alone against so many. Kimo gritted his teeth. I only learned right then that she had long been colluding with the enemy general, and agreed to let their troops in at that moment. But even if I was destined to die in battle, before I died, I was going to kill that traitor no matter what. So I sent a troop of soldiers to charge up the city tower, and we dragged her down and hung her dead over the city pit. Hung on that pole. After the enemy troops passed, the kingdom of Banyue became a dead realm. The state preceptor and the general who died in the battle also became trapped within the ruins, both keeping watch over the other in mutual grudge and hate. So, Shilin said, General Kimo, you led the Banyue soldiers under you to search for that shadow, the state preceptor, everywhere, and every time you capture her, you hang her dead over the sinner's pit? It won't be enough even if we hang her dead 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, Kimo exclaimed, because she's been apprehending all my soldiers who turned wrath and throwing them into the sinner's pit. She set up a powerful array around the pit that only she herself can break. Once you fall, you can never climb back up. And those of us who have been betrayed by her, those soldiers who died wrongfully in battle, hold a deep resentment that only devouring the flesh and blood of those from Yong'an can appease, and thus allow us to slowly pass from this earth with our hatred released. Otherwise, they can only howl into the long nights without absolution. Is that why you keep capturing people to feed them? Shilin asked. What else can we do? Kimo replied. Listen to them wail down below and do nothing? The people you threw down, did you catch them yourselves, or? We can't stray too far from the kingdom of Banyue. But thankfully, her snakes like to haunt the area and often crawl out of the ruins to bite people. And caravans who suffer bites come into the city to look for the Shanwei fern. That mud face in the palace, was it you who buried him? That's right. The man buried in the earth was originally planning on stealing the riches of the palace. But all the treasures our kingdom had were cleared out by those Yong'an men 200 years ago. Why did you bury him instead of throwing him down here directly? Shilin asked. There's gotta be fertilizer to grow the ferns, you know, Kimo replied. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to hold the scorpion snakes back. We don't want to run into those creatures either. That's not right, Shilin thought. If Kimo and his party consciously knew how to grow and fertilize Shanwei ferns, going as far as using live humans as fertilizer, then it was clear that even though they were no longer alive, their fear of those scorpion snakes was still strong. In that case, that fear must have been even greater while they were alive. If that Banyue state preceptor could control a murder weapon as great as those scorpion snakes, then how was she so easily dragged down the city tower by a bunch of soldiers and hanged to death? According to Kimo, in the past 200 or so years, he had captured the state preceptor over and over and hanged her dead repeatedly. Either way, HuaLian felt that if it were him, and he had such a killing weapon in his hands, he would never allow the enemy the chance to come near him. And regarding the scorpion snakes that would slither out the ruins to bite people, was that an accident? Not likely. It was more likely that they were purposely trying to lure people into the pass. Then was the State Preceptor doing so intentionally? Wouldn't that only be helping Kimo catch live humans to feed his soldiers? Mutual hatred wouldn't make sense. Were they pretending to be enemies then? What was the point of that? And in all of this mess, there was also the mysterious lady in white and her companion. HuaLian decided to ask more questions. General Kimo, when we first entered the city, we saw two ladies, one in white and the other in black. Do you know who they are? Before there was a response, Sanlang whispered, "Shh." HuaLian didn't know what was going on, but he closed his mouth immediately. A strange hunch made him look up. It was the same framed dark blue sky with a crescent moon. But next to the moon, he saw a person. A small, black-clad silhouette was peering over the edge and looking down. After watching them for a bit, the small form suddenly grew bigger. It had jumped down. As the figure fell, HuaLian could see clearly that it was the State Preceptor who had been hanging from the pole earlier. Kimo, what's going on? The State Preceptor asked in the Banyue tongue as she landed. The moment she spoke, HuaLian thought her voice was very different from what he imagined. Although it certainly sounded somber, her voice was tiny. It was like the muttering of a sulky child, not cool or powerful at all. If not for his good hearing, HuaLian might not have even heard her properly. What's going on? They're all dead! Kimo shouted. How did they die? The State Preceptor asked. Is it because you pushed them all down and trapped them in this godforsaken place? Who's there? There's another person, the State Preceptor said. There actually should have been two people at the bottom of the pit, besides Kimo. But Sanlang had neither breath nor heartbeat, so the State Preceptor didn't detect his presence. It was also complete chaos on top of the walls earlier, and no one had kept track of who fell and who ran away. So she thought there was only HuaLian. They're the ones who killed all my soldiers! You happy now? They're finally all dead! The State Preceptor was silent. Suddenly, a tiny burst of light flared, illuminating a small, black-clad girl conjuring a palm torch. The girl surprisingly appeared to be only 15 or 16. She was dressed in plain black cultivator robes, and her eyes were gloomingly black as well. She was not unbeautiful, just unhappy. Her forehead and cheeks were covered with bruises, clear and distinct under the light. If it hadn't been confirmed earlier, no one would believe that the State Preceptor of Banyue could be such a pale young girl. The flames in her hand illuminated herself and her surroundings. At her feet were the armored corpses of Banyue soldiers. The palm torch in the State Preceptor's hand was very small and did not light up the entire pit, so they were still immersed in darkness. But borrowing the small light, HuaLian could still see the red-robed figure beside him. Perhaps it was his imagination, but although Sanlang had already been taller than him before, he now appeared even taller somehow. HuaLian's gaze slowly moved upward and came to the youth's throat. He stopped for a moment, then continued upward, his eyes stopping at an elegantly shaped chin. The features of Sanlang's upper face was still hidden in the shadows, but HuaLian thought the bottom half was subtly different from before. No less handsome, but the lines were much more defined. Feeling he was being watched, Sanlang tilted his head, and his lips curled upward slightly. Perhaps he wanted so much to get a better look, to get nearer, that without realizing it, HuaLian took a step closer to him. Just then, Kimo wailed in the distance, seemingly in shock after seeing the bloody tragedy before him. HuaLian abruptly snapped out of it and turned to look, and saw Kimo clutching his own head. Despite the general's cries, the State Preceptor's expression remained wooden, and she only nodded. good. In the midst of mourning, hearing those words made Kimo rage once more. Good? What's good? What do you mean? Good means we're finally free, the state preceptor said. She turned to HuaLian, who was still shrouded in the dark. Are you the one who killed them? It was an accident, HuaLian replied. You're lying through your teeth, Kimo exclaimed. HuaLian responded bold-facedly. Life is full of accidents. The state preceptor gave him a look, but her expression was unreadable. Who are you? Her words were spoken in perfect Han dialect, and weren't said in an interrogative tone. I'm a heavenly official. This one here is my friend, HuaLian replied. Kimo couldn't understand their words, but could tell they weren't fighting and demanded. What are you two saying? The state preceptor looked HuaLian over and eyed Sanlang for a moment before quickly looking away. We never had heavenly officials visit before. I thought you all already abandoned this place. HuaLian had expected that they would have to fight the state preceptor of Banyue, but was surprised to find her this despondent and devoid of any will to fight. She continued. Do you two want to leave? Of course we do. But there's an array set in this pit, so we can't, HuaLian said. Hearing this, the state preceptor walked to one of the walls, raised her hand, and drew something. She then turned around and said, There, I released the array. You two can leave now. This was way too easy. HuaLian really didn't know what to say. Just then, a voice called from above. Hey, is anyone down there? If not, I'm leaving. It was Fu Yao's voice. HuaLian heard Sanlang next to him and immediately looked up. There was a shadow of a man looking down into the pit. HuaLian shouted, Fu Yao! There are people down here! I'm down here! He waved and Fu Yao shouted back from above. You're actually down there? What's at the bottom besides you? Lots of things. Why don't you come down and see for yourself? HuaLian said. Fu Yao probably thought the same, and with a loud rumble, he hurled a large ball of fire into the pit. In an instant, the entire sinner's pit was lit up, bright like day, and HuaLian finally saw clearly the kind of place he'd been standing in. All around him were mountains of bloody corpses piled high, innumerable bodies of Banyue soldiers stacked on top of each other, faces and limbs blackened. Dark blood smearing their bright armor. The corner where HuaLian stood was the only spot in the entire sinner's pit that did not have a dead body. This was all done in a flash, in the dark, by Sanlang after he jumped in. HuaLian turned to gaze at the youth next to him again. Before, in the dark, he vaguely saw that Sanlang looked taller and subtly different in certain features. But now, under the bright firelight, the one standing next to him was the same handsome youth he knew. When he saw HuaLian looking over, he smiled. HuaLian looked down to check his wrists and boots, and both were also the same as before, having nothing that would cause any jingling sound. Just then, HuaLian heard a muffled noise. It was the sound of Fu Yao jumping down. Weren't you looking after the merchants? HuaLian asked. Having just entered the pit, Fu Yao wasn't yet used to the stench of blood and fanned his hand to make the air flow. He replied indifferently. We waited for over 6 hours and there was still no sign of you, so we figured something had happened. I drew a circle for them to wait in and came to check things out myself. HuaLian frowned. The circle won't last long. With you gone, what if they leave the circle thinking you left them behind? Fu Yao shrugged. 8 horses can't pull back a man who really wants to seek death. I can't stop stubborn people, so I won't try. What's with those two over there? Who's who? Fu Yao was on full alert, his guard raised against the two unknowns. But he soon discovered in astonishment that Kimo was already heavily wounded on the ground, barely able to stand, and the state preceptor of Banyue was quiet with her head hung low. That one is the general of Banyue, and the other one is the state preceptor of Banyue. Right now, they're... Kimo suddenly leapt up before HuaLian could finish. He had been laying on the ground, gathering his strength, and was finally able to jump up with a shout, aiming his fists at the state preceptor of Banyue. A large, beefy warrior attacking a little girl? Normally, HuaLian would never allow that sort of thing to happen before him. But Kimo had every reason to hate the state preceptor, and she could defend herself perfectly well. However, she didn't, and allowed herself to be thrown around like a broken rag doll. Kimo shouted at the state preceptor. "Where are your scorpion snakes? Come on! Let them bite me to death too! Give me that release!" The state preceptor gloomily replied. "Kimo, my snakes don't listen to me anymore." "Then why don't they kill you?" he scoffed. "I'm sorry, Kimo." The state preceptor apologized softly. "Do you really hate us that much?" The state preceptor shook her head, and Kimo became angrier. "You're going to be the death of me. If you don't hate us, why did you betray us? You shameless spy, disgusting mole, traitor!" Fu Yao watched him strike harder and harder. The blows were all single-sided, and he couldn't help but frown. What are they saying? Shouldn't we stop them? HuaLian couldn't watch anymore either, and rushed forward to stop Kimo. "General? General! Why don't you tell us who that Yongan thug really is, and we'll..." Suddenly, the state preceptor seized his wrist. The grip was hard and came unexpectedly, and HuaLian's heart dropped, thinking she was going to attack him. But when he looked back down at her, the state preceptor was on all fours on the ground. There was a small bruise at the corner of her mouth, and her head was raised, staring at him intently. She didn't say a single word, but her dark eyes were intense with the fire of light. This demeanor overlapped with an image from a far-gone memory. After a pause, HuaLian blurted, "It's you?" The state preceptor also called, "General Hua?" This back and forth stunned everyone in the pit. Fu Yao rushed forward, knocked Kimo out with a punch, and demanded, "You two know each other?" HuaLian didn't have the time to answer him, however. He knelt down, gripped the shoulders of the state preceptor, and examined her face. They'd been standing too far apart before, and he couldn't see clearly. Plus, it had been over 200 years. This girl had matured in that time, and for many reasons, he didn't recognize her at first. But now that he looked again properly, it was the same face from his memories. HuaLian couldn't speak for the longest time, and it was a good moment before he sighed. "Banyue?" The state preceptor quickly clutched at his sleeves, surprisingly a little excited. "It's me. General Hua, do you still remember me?" "Of course I still remember you, but..." HuaLian gazed at her for a moment and sighed. "But what have you done to yourself?" When she heard that, the state preceptor's eyes suddenly filled with pain. "I'm sorry, Captain. I messed up," she muttered. In that exchange, there was General this, Captain that, making it glaringly obvious to the bystanders. Fu Yao was dumbstruck. "Captain? General? You? How did this happen? Then the tomb of the general is..." HuaLian nodded. "My tomb." "Didn't you say you only came to collect scraps 200 years ago?" Fu Yao questioned. "This is a long story. That was originally the plan," HuaLian answered. "Around 200 years ago, due to certain reasons, HuaLian couldn't muck around in the east anymore and decided to stay out of sight for a while. He had planned to cross the Qing Ridge and head to the south to start a brand new life of scraps. Thus, he took up his compass and walked southward. But the more he walked, the more he thought woefully. Why was the scenery all wrong? There should have been an abundance of trees and greenery, cities and life, so how come his path was becoming more desolate? However, HuaLian pushed his suspicions aside and stubbornly continued. He walked and came upon the Gobi Desert. It took a gust of wind blowing a fistful of sand into his face for HuaLian to finally realize that his compass had long been broken. The direction it guided him, that entire journey, was wrong. Since there wasn't anything he could do about the whole thing, he thought that he might as well take this chance to visit the desert scenery. So he continued onward. The only difference was that he changed course slightly at the last minute for a destination to the northwest, and finally arrived at the border, where he temporarily settled near the kingdom of Banyue. At first, I was just collecting junk or something in the area, HuaLian said. But the border was troubled, and with so many skirmishes, there were often runaway soldiers, so the army would draft anyone to make up the numbers. So you were forced into the army? Sanlang asked. Yeah, HuaLian replied. But doing anything was more or less the same, so it didn't matter to me. And then, after chasing away some bandits a couple times, I somehow got promoted to captain. The ones who gave me face would call me General too. Why did she call you General Hua? Fu Yao questioned. Your surname isn't Hua. HuaLian waved his hand and said dismissively, Don't worry about that. I randomly made up a fake name at the time. I think it was Hua Xie. Hearing the name, Sanlang's face changed slightly, his lips faintly twitching. HuaLian didn't notice and continued. With a battle-torn border came many orphans. When I was free, I'd play with them sometimes. One of them was named Banyue. When there were bandits, HuaLian was surely the bravest soldier, and no one dared block his way, nor even dared to stand beside him. But when there weren't, it was as if anyone could order him around. One day, he went and sat by a wall to start a campfire, using his own helmet to cook. As he cooked, the smell of it drifted out, and a few enraged soldiers came and kicked over whatever it was he was cooking. HuaLian picked up his helmet with a broken heart, and when he looked back, he saw a small, disheveled, grimy child crouched behind him. She was picking up the stuff knocked to the ground with her hands and stuffing it into her mouth without caring whether it was too hot. He was shocked. Don't! Wait, little kid, you! As expected, that little kid scarfed down a few lumps of the stuff she had picked off the ground and then dry heaved harshly, crying loudly. HuaLian was so shaken that he picked her up upside down and ran laps until all the stuff she ate came back out. After that was done, he crouched down and wiped his sweat. Are you alright, little one? I'm so sorry, but don't ever tell your parents about this, and next time, don't pick up any more random stuff off the ground to eat. Wait, what are you doing now? That child's face was covered in tears, but she still went to pick food off the ground again, wanting to eat. It was only after HuaLian grabbed her that he realized that the skin of this child's stomach was practically pressed to the back of her bones. When people were starved to that point, anything could be eaten. Even if it was disgusting to the point of tears, she would still eat it. HuaLian had no choice and went to get her the last of his rations. After that incident, he would often see the child stalking him in the shadows nearby. In his memories, the little girl Banyue was always gloomy. Her body and face were covered in bruises, and when she looked at him, she would clutch the hem of his clothes and stare at him just so from below. Because she was singled out by the children of the Banyue kingdom, besides HuaLian, only a particular young'un boy living at the border would sometimes pay attention to her. She spent her days tagging along behind the two of them. She rarely spoke, but she was fluent in the Han dialect, so HuaLian didn't know where she came from. But she was a random wandering child, so he randomly took her in. When he was free, sometimes he'd teach her songs, sometimes wrestle, sometimes show off his busker move, shattering boulders on one's chest, and other stuff. And they got along quite well. HuaLian shook his head. I had thought the Banyue in the state preceptor's title was the country. I didn't know it was actually the name of the state preceptor. And then? Fu Yao asked. And then, it's pretty much the same as what the memorial wrote, HuaLian said. After some silence, Sanlang spoke up. The memorial said you died. As for that memorial, HuaLian was extremely bummed out. Weren't memorials usually full of praise and exaggerated good deeds to glorify the deceased? All those mention of his demotions aside, why did it have to so seriously record the embarrassing way he died? While they were hiding away from the sandstorm and he read to this part, he could barely look at it straight on. If it wasn't for Sanlang, who also understood Banyue script and was watching him, he would have pretended that section never existed. Having something like that written down, even he wanted to laugh at it, never mind other people. And he didn't even have the nerve to ask those seeking shelter in his memorial not to laugh as they commentated and joked about his epitaph. That made him feel really bummed. HuaLian's forehead was becoming red from all the rubbing. Oh, that. Of course I didn't die. I faked it. Fu Yao had a face full of disbelief. HuaLian explained himself. I got trampled too hard and couldn't get up, so there wasn't any option besides faking my death. Truthfully, HuaLian couldn't quite remember exactly how he died, nor why that battle broke out in the first place, only that it was over something petty. He really hadn't wanted to fight, and victory or defeat were meaningless. But by then his rank could go no lower, and no one would listen to him. In the midst of battle, everyone saw red, so when he rushed out and both sides saw it was him, for some reason, all the blades and swords went after him and cut him down. Fu Yao questioned. You must have been standing in the middle being an eyesore, and that raised the ire of both sides, right? Otherwise, why would people cut you down on sight? Besides, I'm sure you knew there were many who hated you, so why didn't you avoid them? Why did you have to charge in? I'm sure you could have avoided the whole thing if you wanted to. I don't really remember, alright? HuaLian said. Even if nothing could kill him, he still couldn't endure that kind of butchering. So with the thought, this can't go on, HuaLian resolutely dropped to the ground to fake his death. But even in death, he was trampled to the point of passing out. It was water choking him that roused him, because corpses were usually thrown into the rivers after battles. HuaLian went with the river's flow and floated back to the kingdom of Yang'an like a heap of junk. Afterward, he took several years to recover from his wounds, then picked up an unbroken compass to start off anew, and finally made it to his original destination in the south. He then stopped paying attention to what went on in the kingdom of Banyue. I'm sorry, Banyue muttered again. Fu Yao furrowed his brow. Why does she keep apologizing to you? Sanlang suddenly spoke up. Kimo stated that the state preceptor of Banyue left for the Central Plains after a clash between the two armies. Were you involved in that? With that reminder, and recalling what was written on the memorial, some things were coming back to HuaLian, though only in bits and pieces. Maybe it was to save me, Banyue said. Everyone turned to look at her, and she said softly, General Hua got flattened because he entered the fray to save me. HuaLian instantly remembered the agony of being trampled by thousands, and he hugged his body despite himself. But when he saw two others watching him with unreadable expressions, he pulled himself back in a hurry. He said, Not flat, not too flat. Who knew why Fu Yao was looking so smug? He said passive-aggressively. Well, aren't you a saint? HuaLian waved dismissively. Nothing of the sort. I don't remember the specifics anymore, but there were two children playing at the time, and I was just going to pick them up and run away immediately. But we didn't manage to retreat fast enough and got caught between the two armies. If that's the case, Fu Yao demanded, how can you not remember something like that? HuaLian replied, Do you not know how many hundreds of years old I am? So much can happen in just a decade, there's no way to remember everything in detail. Besides, some things are best forgotten, rather than remembering how I was butchered and trampled hundreds of years ago. I prefer to remember that I ate a delicious meat bun yesterday, no?
I'm sorry,
Banyue said. HuaLian sighed. Oh, Banyue. Saving you was my own choice. You're not at fault. If you're going to apologize, perhaps it should be to others. Banyue was taken aback and hung her head in silence. HuaLian continued. But maybe it's because my impression of you is from 200 years ago. But I don't think you're the kind of child who'd seek revenge and betray others. Will you tell me what exactly happened? Why did you open the city gates? Banyue contemplated, shook her head, and remained silent. Then why did you let the snakes out to bite people? HuaLian asked. This time, Banyue answered. I didn't release the snakes. HuaLian was taken aback. What? I didn't release the snakes, Banyue repeated. They ran off on their own. I don't know why, but they don't listen to me anymore. Hearing this, Fu Yao grew impatient. Banyue pleaded. General Hua, I'm not lying. Before HuaLian responded, Fu Yao cut in rudely. Anyone would say that after being captured. Even if you say it wasn't intentional. I've heard all that before. All those people crossing the pass were clearly injured by your snakes. Show me your hands. You're under arrest. Banyue shut up and extended both arms. Fu Yao immediately took out an immortal binding rope and apprehended both Banyue and Kimo. Then he said, All right, we've accomplished our goal for this trip. It's all over now. Just then, Sanlang spoke up. She had no reason to lie. HuaLian also felt there was a need for further interrogation. He turned to Banyue. Can you not control any of your snakes? Banyue answered. I can control them, and they'll obey most of the time. But there are times where they won't. I don't know why. After some thought, HuaLian said, Why don't you call them out and show us? Banyue was kneeling before him. Now, she finally rose to her feet and nodded. Soon, a wine-red scorpion snake slithered out from underneath the corpse, raised its head, and curled itself on a pile of dead bodies. It soundlessly flicked its tongue at the group. HuaLian was about to take a closer look at the snake, but saw Banyue widen her eyes, face strange. HuaLian's heart dropped, and he thought, Oh no. As that thought crossed his mind, the snake stopped flicking its tongue, opened its mouth, and pounced at him in attack. It was a sudden lunge, but HuaLian was ready. He was about to grab for it when, boom, something exploded. When he opened his eyes again to see, the snake was already a splatter of guts on the ground, having been thoroughly blown apart. It was a calculated blast too, since none of the venom spilled. HuaLian immediately remembered another time when a snake died like that before they entered the Banyue ruins. But there was no need to say who did it at this point. He hadn't even had the chance to look at Sanlang before a red sleeve flashed before him, barring and separating him from Banyue. On the other side, Fu Yao said coldly, I knew she was lying. Did you think that snake would manage to bite him under these circumstances? Foolish. Banyue's face was already pale when she saw that snake, and when she heard him, her head shot up. I didn't do it. I said there are some snakes that don't obey me, and that one was one of them just now. Fu Yao didn't believe a single word. Who knows whether it was disobeying or obeying you? That one was not even called forth by me, Banyue said glumly. HuaLian was about to speak when another two wine-red scorpion snakes poked out from under a different corpse, flicking their tongues and watching them intently. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth. From the mountains of dead bodies and every corner of the pit, there came innumerable scorpion snakes. Everyone stared at Banyue, who was kneeling on top of a pile of corpses, and Fu Yao started spinning a ball of spiritual energy in his palm and shouted at her. Make them go away! They can't all disobey! Banyue scrunched up her brows, looking as if she was trying to drive them out. Yet more and more scorpion snakes appeared, curling and crawling, slithering ever closer. Bites from 1 or 2 snakes might not kill them, but from hundreds or thousands was harder to say. Even if they didn't die, it wouldn't be pretty. HuaLian raised his wrist, about to call forth Roye, but saw that when the snakes slithered to a certain distance, they would stop and hesitate, forming a weird circle. It dawned on HuaLian, and he glanced at Sanlang next to him. He was watching the snakes with condescension and immense contempt. The scorpion snakes seemed to be able to read his eyes and didn't dare approach. They backed off bit by bit, lowering their heads as they did so, pressing their savage heads against the ground submissively like servants. But there seemed to be another power controlling them, not allowing them to abandon their attacks and leave completely. Thus, many of the snakes turned around and slithered toward Fu Yao. Fu Yao swung his hand and a blast of flames burst from his sleeve, killing a circle of snakes and forcing back another. That wouldn't last long, however. HuaLian said, "Let's get out of here first." Whoosh. Roye shot out from HuaLian's arm and flew upward. But a moment later, another whoosh, and it was back on HuaLian's arm. HuaLian was slightly taken aback and raised his wrist, scolding the silk band now rewrapped around it. "What are you doing back here? The array was released. There's nothing stopping you anymore. Hurry and go." But Roye remained wrapped around his arm, trembling, as if it had bumped into something terrifying at the top. HuaLian was about to coax it some more when suddenly, a long rope of something fell. Plop. It dropped on Fu Yao's shoulder. Fu Yao went to grab it, and his face changed the moment he brought it before his eyes. It was another scorpion snake that fell from the sky. This caught Fu Yao off guard, and after getting bitten, he hurled the snake toward Banyue. Even with her hands tied, she still reflexively tried to catch the snake, and after having caught it, the dark red snake curled itself up around her arm without attacking. Just then, another plop, and a second scorpion snake landed on the ground. HuaLian could guess why Roye refused to go up now. Borrowing the faint light of the moon, HuaLian raised his head and only just barely saw this sight. Hundreds of little wine-red dots were falling rapidly into the sinner's pit. A snake deluge. The red dots were coming closer. HuaLian yelled, "Fu Yao, fire! Shoot a stream of fire upward and get rid of them while they're still in the air." Fu Yao bit his palm to break the skin, swung his hand, and a series of blood drops shot out. An instant later, they transformed into a screen of fire that jetted up through the pit. Those sweeping flames rose over 30 meters and hung in midair, disintegrating all scorpion snakes that touched them, burning them to ash, dissolving the snake deluge. Temporarily safe, HuaLian let out a breath of relief. "That was good, Fu Yao. Thank goodness for you." A spell like that evidently consumed an immense amount of spiritual power, and after one round, Fu Yao's face was pale. He turned around and ignited a ring of fire, dispelling the snakes on the ground, and shouted at Banyue, "And you say those snakes don't obey you? If you weren't controlling them, why wouldn't they attack you?" Sanlang laughed. "Maybe it's because of your bad luck. They didn't attack us either." Fu Yao turned to look at him, his eyes sharp and narrowed. HuaLian could sense trouble. He'd somewhat established a theory about the current situation, but hadn't yet had time to sort through his thoughts. And HuaLian didn't want to see the two of them start fighting now. "Let's figure out what's going on with those snakes first," HuaLian said. "Let's charge out." Fu Yao sneered. "What's going on? Either the state preceptor of Banyue is lying, or the one next to you is causing trouble." HuaLian glanced at Banyue, then at Sanlang, and said, "I don't think it's either of them." His tone was gentle but firm. It was the conclusion he came to after much thought. However, Fu Yao must have thought he was shielding them intentionally, and the face illuminated by the flames was unkind. HuaLian couldn't tell if he was angry or laughing. "Your Royal Highness," Fu Yao said, "don't play pretend when you know the truth. Do you still remember your place? I'm sure you're already very well aware of who exactly that cad next to you is. I refuse to believe you haven't realized it.